He grabbed a pregnant woman by the throat right on the street, pinned her against the wall, and thought no one would stop him. But he didn't know her husband was Chuck Norris. And what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The Texas sun had a way of painting the evenings in warm, amber hues that softened even the most hardened landscapes. The horizon stretched endlessly, the sky like an open book, and in the heart of that wide land sat a modest but welcoming home. It wasn't the kind of house that shouted wealth or ostentation. Rather, it carried the quiet dignity of two people who valued peace over grandeur. This was where Chuck Norris lived with his wife Gina, and where life, after decades of battles and accolades, had settled into something simple. On the porch, flowers Gina had planted swayed gently in the breeze, their colors softened by the setting sun. The air carried the mixed scents of freshly cut grass, barbecue smoke from a neighbor's yard, and the faint tang of dust from the long road that wound past the ranch. The world outside seemed to have slowed, and for Chuck, that stillness was a blessing he had earned. He wasn't just a figure etched into American folklore, not just the man whose name carried a weight in martial arts and cinema. Here at home, he was a husband, soon to be a father again, and a man determined to protect the quiet life he had built. Inside, Gina moved with the deliberate care of a woman whose body carried both the weight of pregnancy and the lightness of expectation. She was radiant, though she did not seek to be. Her figure was fuller now, softened by the child she carried, but there was an undeniable strength in her movements. She stacked folded laundry with precise hands, pausing every so often when the baby shifted inside her. She had learned not to speak much about discomfort. Instead, she wore her serenity like armor, her smile disarming even in moments when fatigue weighed on her. Chuck, meanwhile, spent much of his afternoons in the training hall he had built just behind the house. It wasn't large, but it was functional, with polished wooden floors, punching bags swaying lightly from chains, and mirrors that reflected not only movements but years of discipline. It was here that local kids came, sons and daughters of farmers, mechanics, and office clerks, eager to learn from a man who seemed larger than life. Chuck did not teach them to fight for glory. He taught them to master themselves, to respect rules, to see discipline not as a burden, but as a gift. Balance, always balance, he would say, as he adjusted the stance of a nervous 15-year-old boy, his hand firm but reassuring. Your body can't be strong if your mind is scattered. Strength begins here. He would tap the side of his head, and the boy would nod with wide eyes, absorbing the lesson, not as a trick of combat, but as wisdom for life. Parents often lingered at the back, watching quietly, whispering to each other with gratitude that someone like Chuck Norris chose to live in their town, to guide their children not with harshness, but with calm authority. When training ended, Chuck would sweep the floor himself, towel draped over his shoulder. He never allowed others to treat him like a legend in this space. Here he was simply a teacher, and like any teacher, he believed in order, respect, and humility. The students filed out, waving goodbyes, and the hall would fall into silence again. Chuck would lock up, glance at the long road stretching toward town, and return to the warm glow of his home, where Gina waited with that quiet smile of hers. Yet beneath the calm of their days, shadows had begun to gather. It started with whispers in the town, rumors that an ex-military man had settled nearby. One who carried his scars not as marks of honor, but as excuses for cruelty. The name floated through diner conversations, carried on hushed tones in the hardware store, spoken with unease in the sheriff's office. He was described as tall, broad, and heavy with the kind of authority that came from years in uniform, but twisted by bitterness. He had been seen drinking heavily, stirring trouble at a local bar, and shouting at people in the parking lot for reasons no one could quite understand. Chuck heard the rumors too, but he had lived long enough to know that stories carried half-truths. He preferred to wait, to see a man's character himself before drawing conclusions. Still, something about the tension in people's voices put him on guard. Gina noticed his quiet reflection during dinners, the way his eyes would narrow slightly when conversation drifted to the subject. She reached across the table one evening, her hand resting on his. "You can't save everyone," she said softly. "I know," Chuck replied, his voice calm, "but I can protect what's mine. That night, as Gina drifted to sleep beside him, Chuck lay awake longer than usual. His instincts, sharpened from years in the military and honed in every fight, whispered that peace was always temporary. He had sought a life away from conflict, but conflict had a way of finding men like him. He had no interest in confrontation, yet deep down he knew, if danger came knocking, he would answer. Days passed with the rhythm of small-town life. Gina's belly grew, and Chuck found himself talking to the unborn child during quiet evenings on the porch, his voice low and tender, sharing dreams of the future. Students continued to train, and neighbors continued to wave as they drove by. Yet behind the calm, the figure of the ex-officer became more visible. He was spotted leaning against his truck outside the gas station, his gaze sharp and unwelcoming. He argued with a young man at the diner until the boy's father stepped in to drag him away. The sheriff received complaints, but when he was confronted, the man dismissed it all with a smirk and a casual, "Old habits die hard." It wasn't just his behavior. It was the way people looked over their shoulders when he passed, the way conversations died when he entered a room. A cloud of unease followed him, darkening the edges of the town's simple life. Chuck noticed it. He noticed the clenched jaws of fathers, the averted eyes of mothers, the stiffness of young men who wanted to defend their pride but knew better. He didn't act. Not yet. For Gina, the days were filled with preparation. She bought baby clothes, folded them neatly into drawers, and decorated a room with soft colors. Sometimes she would sit by the window, watching the quiet street, one hand resting on her belly. She didn't speak of her fears, but they lived in her eyes. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that peace was fragile. She had watched Chuck's life enough to understand that trouble could arrive uninvited, and she prayed silently that this time it would pass them by. But peace in their world was a thin veil, and the shadow that lurked on the horizon was growing closer. For now, the house of Chuck and Gina Norris was filled with laughter, warmth, and the anticipation of new life. Yet beyond the edges of their land, in the dim corners of bars and under the neon lights of gas stations, a man whose soul had hardened into violence watched, waiting for a moment to impose his darkness. And when he found it, the fragile line between peace and chaos would snap. The days that followed seemed much like any other, the rhythm of small-town life unbroken on the surface. Gina spent her mornings preparing the nursery, folding the tiny clothes she had bought, sometimes pausing to rest a hand on her stomach when the baby shifted inside her. Chuck divided his time between the training hall and the house, his quiet discipline steadying both the young students who came to him for guidance and the home life that meant more to him than any of the medals or belts he had ever earned. To the casual eye, everything remained peaceful, yet under the surface the air felt charged, as though the town itself was waiting for something to happen. Conversations in the diner grew quieter when a certain name was mentioned, and the laughter of children in the streets sometimes faltered when a tall, heavy figure appeared at the edge of the block. The ex-officer had made himself a presence that could not be ignored. People avoided his gaze, though they could feel it on them like a weight. He had already been seen in too many places where trouble seemed to follow. His voice raised in anger, his hand quick to slam against a counter or shove another man out of his way. Chuck had noticed the ripple of unease spreading through the community. And though he remained outwardly calm, Gina could read him too well. His quiet moments had grown longer, his eyes narrowing slightly when headlights slowed too long in front of their house, or when unfamiliar footsteps crunched the gravel road behind him. He said nothing to alarm her, yet she knew. The instincts that had kept him alive in battle were stirring again, and instincts never woke without reason. It was late afternoon when Gina decided to walk into town to pick up a few things. She preferred the small store down the street, where the owner greeted her warmly and asked after her pregnancy with genuine kindness. The day was clear, the air heavy with the warmth of the Texas sun, but by the time she left the shop, the light was starting to fade and long shadows stretched across the quiet road. She carried her bags carefully, balancing them so as not to strain herself, her thoughts drifting to Chuck and the baby. There was something comforting about these walks, a reminder of the normal life she had always wanted, a family, a town that felt safe, evenings filled with small routines rather than fear. As she turned down a quieter street, The sound of her footsteps seemed louder than usual, the emptiness around her almost pressing. She kept her pace steady, determined not to give in to the unease that was slowly rising in her chest. Then she heard it, the scuff of boots on pavement, heavy and deliberate. A voice followed, low and sharp. "Well, look who it is." She froze for only a fraction of a second before turning. He was there, the man whose shadow had already stretched across the town. The ex-officer stood a few yards away, his posture loose but his eyes hard, the smirk on his face carrying the smugness of someone who knew people feared him. His uniform days were long gone, yet he carried himself with the swagger of rank, though it had curdled into something darker, more dangerous. "Evening," Gina said quietly, her instinct urging her to keep moving. She tried to step past him, but he shifted deliberately, blocking her path. "You're Chuck Norris's wife, aren't you?" he asked, though it sounded less like a question and more like an accusation. She didn't answer. Her silence seemed to amuse him, and he let out a short, humorless laugh. "Thought so. The great man's woman. Pregnant too, huh? Must be nice thinking you're untouchable because of who your husband is." Gina steadied her breath, keeping her expression calm. "I'd like to go home now," she said simply, trying to step around him again. But his hand shot out quickly, catching her arm with a grip far too rough. She gasped at the suddenness, the sharp pressure against her skin. His face drew closer, the stench of alcohol heavy on his breath. "You don't walk away from me," he growled, his voice low, vibrating with menace. "You think you're better than the rest of us because you've got his name?" Her heart pounded, the instinct to fight or flee surging, but she was painfully aware of her condition. She couldn't twist free as easily as she once might have. Her pulse quickened, the world narrowing to the rough hand that held her and the wall of his body that blocked her path. She tried to pull back, but his grip only tightened, and with sudden violence he shoved her against the cold brick wall of a building. The shock stole her breath, her back striking hard, her bags spilling to the ground as the groceries scattered. His hand came up, closing around her throat with terrifying speed. She gasped, instinctively clutching his wrist, trying to pry it away, but his strength bore down like an iron vise. The pressure cut off her air, panic flashing through her as her lungs burned. She thought of the child inside her, of the tiny heartbeat that depended on hers, and fear gripped her deeper than any she had ever known. The street was empty. There were no cars, no pedestrians, no one to intervene. The sound of her desperate breaths filled her ears, the roughness of his palm against her skin burning as he pressed her harder into the wall. He leaned in close, his eyes cold and unfeeling, his mouth twisted in a sneer. "You see," he whispered, his words dripping with venom. "People like me don't take orders from anyone anymore. Not from the military, not from the law, and sure as hell, not from your husband." Her vision blurred at the edges, spots dancing before her eyes. Still, she refused to give him the satisfaction of breaking. She did not scream. She did not beg. Even with her strength failing, she held on to her silence, her defiance in the face of his brutality. Inside her, anger flickered, a quiet, steady flame that refused to die out. The seconds stretched like hours. Her chest heaved, her fingers clawing against his arm, the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The weight of helplessness threatened to crush her, yet beneath it lived a deeper truth. She was not entirely alone. She had always known that Chuck would never let harm come to her if he could help it, and though she could not hear his footsteps yet, she felt in her heart that he would come. The officer's voice grew harsher, his grip unrelenting. "Let's see what your hero husband does when he finds out he couldn't even protect you on his own street." Her knees buckled slightly, her body struggling for oxygen, but she refused to give him the reaction he wanted. There was no surrender in her eyes, only the glimmer of defiance that burned through the haze of fear. The quiet street bore witness to the violence, the sound of bags rustling in the dirt, the low growl of a man lost in his own fury, and the rasping breaths of a woman fighting to hold on. Somewhere in the distance, a door shut, a dog barked, and life went on, unaware of the danger unfolding in this darkened corner of town. And then, as the world seemed to press in tighter, as the grip on her throat cut deeper and her vision dimmed, a new sound broke through the heavy, measured steps of boots on pavement. steady, deliberate, each one carrying a weight that promised something was about to change. The officer did not hear it at first, too absorbed in his dominance, but Gina felt it like a lifeline. She knew that rhythm, the calm authority in every step. Relief and dread collided inside her, because while salvation had arrived, it also meant that the line had been crossed. For the first time since the man's hand closed around her throat, Gina's eyes shifted. She looked past him, toward the figure emerging from the shadows of the street, the familiar outline of broad shoulders, the controlled gait of a man who had faced down countless dangers before, now coming closer with a calm that was more terrifying than any roar. Chuck Norris was there, and with his arrival, the fragile peace that had held their lives together would shatter. The confrontation that had been building in silence was about to explode, and the man who thought himself untouchable was about to learn what it meant to threaten the woman Chuck Norris loved. The ex-officer's hand was still pressed hard against Gina's throat, his body leaning into hers as though the sheer weight of his presence was meant to remind her how helpless she was in that moment. She could feel the brick wall at her back, rough and unyielding, each jagged edge biting into her skin through her blouse as she struggled to remain upright. The pressure at her neck was unbearable, stealing her breath, forcing shallow gasps that barely reached her lungs. Yet even as her vision blurred and her chest ached with the desperate need for air, she did not cry out. She had made a choice in her silence, one that carried defiance. What she could not know was that silence would be answered, for a new sound was breaking through the suffocating stillness of the street. The footsteps were measured, each one deliberate and steady, the kind of steps that carried certainty rather than haste. Gina felt them before the officer noticed. Something in her body recognized that rhythm, the calm confidence in each movement. A wave of relief swept through her, though it was tempered by fear, for she knew that Chuck would never stand aside once he saw her in danger. Her eyes shifted just slightly, past the man's shoulder, toward the figure that emerged from the shadows, with a presence that needed no announcement. Chuck Norris had returned from the training hall earlier than expected, his gym bag slung casually over his shoulder, his body carrying the same controlled strength that had once carried him across battlefields and film sets alike. He had been walking home, his mind already shifting toward dinner with Gina, when the scene ahead of him snapped his instincts into sharp focus. The sight of his wife pinned against the wall, her hands clawing at the wrist of a man twice as arrogant as he was strong, ignited a fire that had been dormant too long. But it was not a fire of rage. It was the cold, steady kind that burned in silence, the kind that knew exactly what needed to be done. "Let her go," Chuck said quietly, his voice carrying a calm authority that cut through the night air. It was not shouted, not barked in anger, but spoken with the kind of certainty that demanded obedience. The officer stiffened slightly, his grip faltering for a moment before tightening again. He turned his head just enough to glance at the man approaching, his lip curling into a sneer. "Look who it is," he said, his tone mocking, though it wavered with the unease of someone who suddenly realized the situation was not as secure as he thought. "The legend himself." Chuck's eyes did not flicker from Gina's face. He saw the strain in her expression, the reddening skin where the hand clamped down, the desperate rise and fall of her chest. Everything in him wanted to charge forward and tear the man away from her, but he knew better. Years of discipline, years of combat and training had taught him that the moment you acted on anger, you gave your opponent an advantage. He continued forward at the same calm pace, his bag slipping silently from his shoulder to the ground. "Release her," he repeated, his voice steady, his eyes sharp. The officer barked a laugh, though it was forced, meant more to convince himself than to intimidate the man now closing the distance. "What are you going to do? You think you can scare me? You're not in the movies here, Norris. You're just another man, and I've broken plenty of men." Chuck's jaw tightened, but his expression remained composed. He stopped just within striking distance, his body relaxed but ready, the stillness of a man who had no doubt what would happen next. He shifted his weight slightly, the subtle adjustment invisible to anyone who did not know the language of combat. "I said let her go," he repeated, his tone colder now, steel behind the calm. The officer's smirk faltered, but he squeezed harder, pressing Gina back into the wall. Or what? He hissed. That was enough. In less than a second, Chuck moved. His hand shot forward, not with wild force, but with the precision of decades of training. Two fingers pressed into the nerve cluster at the officer's wrist, a precise point that sent a searing jolt of pain shooting up the man's arm. The grip around Gina's throat collapsed instantly, her body stumbling forward as the pressure vanished. Chuck caught her gently with one arm, easing her to the side, his body instinctively placing itself between her and the threat. Before the officer could react, Chuck pivoted. His movements were smooth, efficient, each one flowing into the next with a clarity that was almost beautiful in its precision. He seized the man's arm, twisting it with exacting control, using the officer's own weight and momentum against him. There was a sharp cry of pain, cut short by the sound of a heavy thud as the man's body slammed into the pavement, the ground reverberating beneath the impact. The groceries lay scattered across the street, cans rolling into the gutter, a carton of milk spilling into the dirt. The silence that followed the thud was deafening, broken only by Gina's uneven breaths as she steadied herself against the wall. Chuck remained standing between her and the fallen man, his stance protective but still calm. He had not struck with fury. He had not lashed out with cruelty. He had neutralized the threat. Nothing more, nothing less. The officer groaned, clutching his arm, his face contorted with both shock and humiliation. He glared up at the man standing over him, his pride stinging more than the physical pain. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice trembling between rage and disbelief. Chuck looked down at him, his eyes as steady as they had been when he first stepped onto the street. "Get up," he said simply, "and leave." For a moment, the officer looked as though he might rise to fight again, but something in Chuck's expression stopped him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even threat. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that only came from a man who had faced death before and had walked away stronger. The officer spat into the dirt, his eyes blazing with unspent fury, and shoved himself to his feet. He staggered for a moment, his pride battling the reality of defeat, then turned sharply and stormed off into the shadows, his boots striking the pavement with frustrated violence. The street was quiet again, the confrontation ending as suddenly as it had begun. Chuck turned back to Gina, his eyes softening instantly as he reached for her hand. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentler now, carrying the concern of a husband rather than the command of a warrior. She nodded, though her breathing was still ragged. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the fear she had felt. She leaned into him, drawing strength from the steady solidity of his presence. Chuck held her for a moment, his arms wrapping around her protectively, his cheek resting briefly against her hair. He did not need to say anything more. The embrace itself was enough, the silent promise that he would always be there, that no matter what shadows threatened them, he would stand between her and the darkness. Yet as he held her, his eyes lifted toward the direction in which the officer had disappeared. The man's words lingered in the air, the venom behind them a reminder that this was not finished. Chuck had ended the moment, but he knew instinctively that it was only the beginning. Trouble had found them, and trouble rarely walked alone. When he finally led Gina back toward the house, her arm linked through his, the groceries abandoned behind them, the night felt different. The peace they had cherished was still there in the rustle of leaves, in the glow of the porch light ahead, but it was thinner now, fragile in a way it had not been before. The shadow that had crept closer was now fully in their lives, and Chuck knew it would not retreat easily. As they stepped inside, Gina sank into a chair, her hand resting instinctively on her stomach, the protective gesture of a mother. Chuck watched her quietly, his mind already working. He had faced enemies before, in jungles, in deserts, on streets far from home. But this was different. This was his home, his wife, his child. And if war had come to his doorstep, then he would answer it on his own terms. Outside, the night stretched on, silent and heavy. Somewhere beyond the glow of the town's lights, the man he had defeated nursed his wounds, his pride twisted into rage, his thoughts already darkening toward revenge. Chuck knew it. He could feel it. And though he did not welcome it, he accepted what was coming. The peace of their lives had been shattered, and the battle that lay ahead would demand every ounce of discipline and strength he still carried. The war had not started on a battlefield. It had started on a quiet street under the dim glow of streetlights with a single act of violence. But Chuck Norris knew better than anyone. Wars were not defined by where they began, but by who was willing to finish them. The night after the attack lingered in Gina's memory with a heaviness she could not shake. Sleep did not come easily, though Chuck had stayed awake beside her, his arm a protective barrier wrapped around her, as though even in rest he would not allow the shadows to creep any closer. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt again the roughness of the officer's hand at her throat, the crushing weight of the wall against her back, and the helplessness that had threatened to overwhelm her. Yet alongside that fear lived another image, one that burned stronger. The moment Chuck had stepped into the darkness, calm and unyielding, moving with the precision of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he could do. It was that memory that finally allowed her to drift into a shallow sleep, her hands still resting on her stomach as though to shield the life within her. Morning came too quickly, and with it the inevitable noise of gossip and rumor spreading through the small town. The confrontation had not gone unseen. Though the street had been empty at the time, neighbors had come out when they heard the thud of the officer's body striking the pavement, and someone, quick with their phone, had captured the final moments of the scuffle. By breakfast, whispers had reached every corner of the community. Chuck Norris had taken down a man whom many already feared. At the diner, at the gas station, in the grocery store, the story repeated itself, details bending and twisting as gossip always does. But the heart of it remained the same. The man who had been terrorizing the town had been humbled, and not by just anyone, by Chuck. Chuck himself moved through the morning with the same discipline he always had. He brewed coffee, sat at the table with Gina, and asked her gently how she felt. His voice was calm, steady, but Gina knew him too well. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the way his mind was already several steps ahead, considering what might come next. "They'll let him go," Chuck said finally, his tone low but certain. Gina looked at him in disbelief. "After what he did? After he attacked me in the middle of the street?" Chuck nodded once. "Men like him rarely stand alone. Someone higher up has been covering for him. That much is clear." And Chuck was right. Before noon, word came that the officer had been arrested briefly, taken into custody for disturbing the peace and assault. But by late afternoon, he was walking free. The explanation given was vague lack of evidence, conflicting accounts, nothing solid enough to hold him. To the townspeople, it was an outrage, though not a surprising one. They had seen smaller incidents vanish into silence before. What was different this time was that his victim had been Gina, and his opponent had been Chuck. The community that had been too afraid to speak now buzzed with frustration, murmurs of protest spreading like wildfire. That evening, as Chuck closed up the training hall after a long day with his students, he found Sheriff Daniels waiting by the door. The sheriff was an older man, his face lined not just by age but by years of compromise. His hat was pulled low, his expression weary. "You know why I'm here," Daniels said, his voice carrying the weight of a man caught between duty and fear. Chuck wiped his hands on a towel, his gaze steady. "You're here to tell me to let it go," Daniels sighed. "It's bigger than you think, Chuck. That man, he's got friends, powerful ones. You push this. You're not just picking a fight with him. You're picking a fight with all of them." "Then maybe it's a fight that needs to be had," Chuck replied, his voice calm but unyielding. Daniels shook his head, his shoulders slumping. "You've got a family to think about, a baby on the way. Don't let this drag you into something you can't control." Chuck didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence itself was an answer, and Daniels knew it. With a heavy breath, the sheriff tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Chuck alone with the quiet creak of the empty hall. At home, Gina was waiting, her expression tight with worry. "They let him go," she said, though she already knew Chuck had heard. "I expected as much," Chuck answered. He sat beside her, taking her hand gently in his. "This isn't just about him. He's a symptom of something bigger. Someone's been protecting him. And if they're willing to protect a man who attacks a pregnant woman on the street, then there's no telling what else they're hiding." Gina's eyes darkened. What do we do? Chuck held her gaze. We don't back down. The days that followed revealed more of the hidden rot. Chuck began hearing stories, quiet confessions from townspeople, emboldened by what they had seen. A shopkeeper admitted he'd been paying protection money after the officer threatened to burn his store down. A young man revealed that he'd been beaten outside the bar, but warned to stay quiet if he didn't want trouble for his family. Teachers at the school whispered that the officer had connections in the district office, that complaints about his behavior had disappeared before they reached the board. Every story pointed to the same truth. This man wasn't just a bully. He was part of a network, a web of former military men and corrupt officials who used their influence to protect one another while preying on the vulnerable. Chuck listened, his expression calm, but inside he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had never sought to be a crusader, never asked for the role of hero. All he had wanted was peace, a quiet life with Gina, a chance to raise his child in safety. But peace could not be built on silence, and now that the silence had been broken, there was no turning back. One night as he sat on the porch with Gina, the cicadas humming in the trees, she placed her hand over his. I'm scared, she admitted softly. I know, he said, his voice low. But you don't need to be. Fear is what they use to control people, and the only way to break it is to stand against it. Her eyes searched his, filled with both love and worry. And what if they come after us again? Chuck squeezed her hand gently. Then they'll find out I don't scare easily. The shadows around them seemed to deepen, the quiet of the night almost too still, as though the town itself was holding its breath. Somewhere out there, the officer nursed his pride and his rage, his allies whispering in dark corners, plotting their next move. Chuck could feel it, the storm building on the horizon. He had lived long enough to recognize the signs. This was no longer about a single man on a quiet street. It was about power, about corruption, about a system that thrived on fear. And as he sat beside his wife, her hand resting on her stomach, Chuck knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not allow his child to be born into a world ruled by men like that. The battle was no longer coming. It had already begun. The storm that had hovered on the horizon finally crept closer, its edges pressing into every corner of town, and Chuck could feel it in the smallest details of daily life. It was in the way cars he didn't recognize slowed as they drove past his house, in the way men in plain clothes lingered too long at the gas station when he stopped for fuel, in the subtle shift of whispers when he entered the diner with Gina. What had begun as one man's violence against his wife was no longer an isolated act. It had widened into something bigger, a battle not only with a single enemy, but with the system that shielded him, a system that thrived in the shadows of fear. At first, the threats were quiet, almost laughable in their predictability. A phone call late at night, the line heavy with silence before a distorted voice muttered, "Walk away, Norris, or you'll regret it." A note slipped under the door of the training hall, written in block letters with no signature, warning him that Gina would not be safe if he kept pushing. Chuck read it once, folded it neatly, and burned it in the fireplace. When Gina asked what it was, he shook his head. He did not want to burden her with the ugliness, though she sensed enough to know the truth without words. But soon the pressure grew heavier. Two men in suits appeared at the training hall one afternoon, interrupting a session with his students. Their smiles were too wide, their voices too smooth, and they praised his work with the children in tones laced with insincerity. Then came the offer, cloaked in civility. "You're a respected man here, Mr. Norris. The town needs people like you, strong role models. But the world is complicated, and sometimes it's better to stay clear of politics. We can make sure you and your family are comfortable if you simply let this situation rest." Chuck didn't respond immediately. He let them speak, let them pour out their veiled bribes, and when they were done, he looked at them with the same calm expression he always wore. "I don't take payment for silence," he said simply. The men left quickly after that, their smiles gone, their footsteps sharp on the wooden floor. That night, Gina sat across from him at the kitchen table, her hands curled around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "It's not going to stop, is it?" she asked quietly. Chuck shook his head. "No, They think fear and money are the only languages people understand. But I don't speak either of those. She studied him, her eyes filled with love and worry. And what if they push harder? What if they try to hurt you, or the baby, or me? He reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. Then they'll find out what happens when they cross the line. But they won't break us. Not now, not ever. As the days passed, it became clear that the network behind the officer was both wider and more insidious than Chuck had first realized. Former military men, bitter and hardened, who used their experience not to protect, but to intimidate. Local officials who looked the other way, enjoying favors in return. Even a few businessmen who had tied their fortunes to the power these men wielded. Together they formed a shield, a wall of influence that made accountability vanish like smoke. And at the center of it was the officer who had laid his hands on Gina, emboldened now by the knowledge that he was not just one man, but the tip of a spear aimed at the entire town. One evening, Chuck walked Gina to bed, watching her settle beneath the covers, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. She smiled at him with quiet strength, as though to tell him she trusted him completely. He kissed her forehead gently and lingered a moment longer, watching her drift into sleep. Then he stepped outside, into the night air heavy with cicadas and the faint scent of dust. He stood on the porch for a long time, his gaze fixed on the road, knowing eyes were on him even now. He wasn't intimidated, but he knew what was coming. The next day, the confrontation escalated. Chuck was leaving the hall after training when he found 3 men waiting near the entrance, the same officer among them. His face was twisted with smugness, his arms still stiff from the hold Chuck had used against him. "You made a mistake," the officer said, his voice loud enough to carry across the parking lot. Chuck stopped, setting his bag down slowly. His students had just left, their laughter still echoing down the street. But the tension that settled in the air was thick, unmistakable. "You already made yours," Chuck replied calmly. The men closed in, their postures aggressive, their eyes sharp. But Chuck did not back away. He stood tall, his hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. Years of training, years of battlefields, had taught him that fear was the greatest weapon these men carried, and he would not give it to them. "You don't belong in this fight," one of the men growled. "I didn't choose it," Chuck answered, his voice steady. "But it came to my home. That makes it mine." The officer sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you're still the man you used to be? You think the legend is enough to protect you? This isn't the movies, Norris. This is real life. And in real life, men like me always win." Chuck's eyes narrowed, his voice firm. "Men like you win only when good people stay silent. I'm not silent." The words landed heavier than any punch, and for a brief moment, the officer faltered. His allies shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Chuck's certainty pressing against their bravado. Then, with a frustrated snarl, the officer stepped back. "This isn't over," he spat, his words echoing as they turned and left. That night, Chuck sat with Gina on the porch, their hands intertwined, the stars burning bright above them. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with unspoken truths, with the weight of what had passed and the knowledge of what was to come. Gina turned to him, her eyes steady despite her fear. "I believe in you," she said simply. Chuck squeezed her hand gently. "Then that's all I need." The days that followed only deepened the tension. The town buzzed with rumors, the people caught between fear and the stirrings of hope. For the first time, they had seen someone stand against the officer and his allies, someone who refused to be bent by threats or bribes. And in that defiance, they began to see the possibility of change. Parents whispered about how Chuck had defended his wife. Children repeated the story with awe. And neighbors who had once kept their heads down now watched with quiet admiration. But Chuck knew admiration alone would not be enough. The men he faced would not stop with threats and intimidation. They would come again, stronger, angrier, more determined. And when they did, he would have to be ready. Not for glory, not for pride, but for Gina, for their child, and for the town that deserved better than to live under the shadow of fear. As he sat alone in the training hall one evening, the smell of sweat and wood filling the air, Chuck closed his eyes and let the silence settle around him. He remembered the lessons he had taught his students: discipline, balance, respect. They weren't just words for children. They were truths he had carried his entire life, and now they would guide him once again. The clash with the system had already begun, and Chuck knew the final confrontation was drawing closer. He didn't know when it would come or how many men he would face, but he was ready. He had faced worse. And this time, the battlefield was not a distant desert or jungle. It was his home, his family, his town. And for that, he would fight harder than ever before. The days after the confrontation outside the training hall carried a strange, heavy silence. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm, not peaceful but oppressive, filled with the weight of something inevitable. Chuck felt it every time he stepped out onto the porch in the evening, the cicadas humming around him, the Texas sky burning red as the sun dipped below the horizon. He could see it in the way cars slowed a little too long as they passed his home, in the way unfamiliar men leaned against the walls outside the bar, watching him with eyes that spoke of malice rather than curiosity. Even Gina could sense it. She tried not to say anything, tried not to add to the burden she knew he already carried, but in her silence there was worry, and in her eyes a plea for the safety of their child. Chuck had lived too many years, fought too many battles, not to recognize the signs. The officer had not forgotten, and his pride was not the kind that allowed humiliation to fade. He was gathering strength, reaching out to his allies, men who had once worn uniforms, but had long abandoned the honor that came with them. Now they wielded their skills and their connections for darker purposes: intimidation, profit, and control. They had protected one another for years, but none of them had faced someone who refused to bend. None of them had faced Chuck. The first strike came quietly, almost like a test. One evening, Chuck returned home to find the gate to their property left wide open, swinging slowly in the wind. The dogs barked furiously at the edge of the yard, and when he investigated, he found tire tracks cut deep into the dirt near the barn. Whoever had come had left quickly, but the message was clear. They could reach him. They could reach Gina. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the tracks, then turned and closed the gate himself, locking it firmly. When he walked back to the porch, Gina was standing there, her arms wrapped around her stomach, her face pale. He didn't say anything to frighten her further, but she knew. She always knew. The escalation came soon after. The officer, emboldened by his network, began making appearances again, louder, bolder, more reckless. He and his men lingered in places where Chuck's students gathered, their sneers meant to intimidate. Parents complained of being followed home from town, of men in trucks parking across from their houses for hours before driving away. The whole community felt the pressure, the fear creeping into their daily lives. It was a silent war, one fought not with open violence, but with threats, shadows, and intimidation. But Chuck understood better than most. Such wars always ended the same way. Sooner or later, silence broke, and fists replaced whispers. It happened on a moonless night. Chuck was locking up the training hall when he sensed them. Years of experience had sharpened his instincts to something more than intuition. The street was too quiet, the shadows too thick, the air too heavy. He turned slowly, scanning the darkness, and saw them emerge. A group of men, 6 in total, their faces hard, their bodies built with the familiarity of violence. The officer was at the front, his posture proud despite the memory of the humiliation Chuck had delivered to him. His voice carried across the empty lot, filled with venom. "You should have left it alone, Norris." Chuck didn't move, his bag still at his feet, his stance relaxed but ready. "You should have never touched my wife." The men spread out, forming a semicircle around him, their boots crunching against the gravel. Some carried pipes. One gripped a chain, and the officer himself cracked his knuckles with a smirk that was meant to disguise the flicker of unease in his eyes. Chuck had seen this before, in alleys overseas, in the chaos of combat zones, in the arenas of competition. Outnumbered, outarmed, but never outmatched, not if you controlled your fear. "Last chance," the officer said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Walk away now, And maybe I'll let you keep breathing. Chuck's gaze didn't waver. He reached down slowly, set his bag aside, and straightened to his full height. His voice was calm, steady, and colder than the night air. I don't walk away. The first man lunged, swinging the pipe with reckless speed. Chuck sidestepped smoothly, his hand snapping out to seize the man's wrist. A twist, a sharp motion, and the pipe clattered to the ground as the attacker screamed in pain. Before he hit the dirt, Chuck pivoted, his foot striking with precision against another man's chest, sending him stumbling backward into the gravel. The chain rattled as another attacker swung, but Chuck dropped low, his elbow driving into the man's ribs before seizing the chain itself and yanking hard. The man toppled, gasping, the chain slipping from his grasp. The fight became chaos, a blur of movement under the dim glow of the streetlight. Yet Chuck's movements were never chaotic. Every strike was measured, every block precise, every motion a lesson in efficiency. He did not fight with rage. He fought with control. He moved through them like water through cracks in stone, flowing, redirecting, breaking them down one by one. The officer watched at first, his smirk fading as each of his men fell, groaning in the dirt. He had underestimated the legend, thinking years of peace had dulled him. But when only he remained standing, pride forced him forward. He roared, charging at Chuck with fists raised, his face twisted with fury. Chuck stood his ground, his eyes steady. The officer swung wildly, his strength fueled by desperation, but strength without discipline was nothing. Chuck blocked, redirected, his body moving with the ease of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering himself. Then came the end, a sharp strike to the ribs, a twist of the arm, and the officer found himself slammed to the ground, his breath torn from his lungs, his body broken not by excess force but by precise, disciplined technique. Chuck stood over him, his chest rising steadily, his face calm. The officer gasped, his pride shattered, his voice trembling. You can't win. They'll never let you. Chuck leaned down, his voice low, cold, and certain. It's not about winning. It's about making sure you can't hurt anyone again. By the time the police arrived, called by frightened residents who had heard the sounds of the fight, the scene was clear. The officer and his men lay sprawled on the ground, groaning and defeated, while Chuck stood tall, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Gina appeared moments later, rushing into the lot, her face pale with fear until her eyes found him. Relief washed over her as she threw her arms around him, her trembling body pressed against his. He held her tightly, the storm inside him finally easing. The arrest that followed sent shockwaves through the town. Investigations peeled back the layers of corruption that had protected the officer and his allies for so long. Files hidden in drawers, records erased, money exchanged under tables, all of it came to light under the scrutiny of law enforcement and the relentless attention of the press once the story broke. The people who had once cowered now stood taller, emboldened by the knowledge that even the untouchable could fall. Senators and officials scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, their power crumbling as their ties to the network were exposed. The officer, once so proud, now sat in a cell, his sneer gone, replaced by the hollow eyes of a man who had lost not just a fight, but the shield of corruption that had defined his life. His allies faced charges, their names dragged into the open, their grip on the town shattered. For Chuck and Gina, life slowly returned to its rhythm. The house once again filled with the warmth of quiet evenings, the nursery completed, the promise of new life only weeks away. Students returned to the training hall. Their respect for their teacher deepened, their eyes brighter with hope. Parents thanked him quietly, some with tears in their eyes, knowing he had stood not only for his wife but for the entire community. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world was bathed in gold, Gina sat on the porch with Chuck, her hand resting on her rounded stomach. She looked at him with a soft smile. "You've given this child a future," she said gently. Chuck shook his head. "We've given it to them together." The air was quiet, peaceful again. The storm finally passed. Chuck closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the silence wash over him. He had not sought this fight, but he had faced it. And in facing it, he had reminded the world of a simple truth he had always known. Real strength is not about dominance or fear. It is about discipline, control, and the courage to stand when others bow. The town would remember what had happened, not just as the night Chuck Norris fought back, but as the moment when silence broke, when fear lost its grip, and when justice, however imperfect, found its way through the cracks. And as the stars blinked awake in the wide Texas sky, Chuck knew that though battles would always come, the greatest victories were not won on fields of war or under bright lights, but here, in the quiet of home, with the people you loved safe in your arms. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't stop here. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next jaw-dropping chapter. Check out our other videos for even more unbelievable true stories that will leave you stunned. And share this video with your friends because stories like this aren't meant to be kept secret.